Welcome to Functional Philosophy, the show in which I, Charles Tew, explain and apply Ayn Rand's philosophy, Objectivism. If you'd like to ask me a question on Objectivism or its application, just go to charlestew.com/contact. And my last name is spelled T as in tango, E as in echo, and W as in whiskey. Howdy, howdy, everyone. The next few questions I have are substantial. Good, but substantial. So we'll see how many I can get through over the next few episodes. First, in the video featuring the discussion between Maddox and Rucka said that Aristotle discovered the law of identity. And in my commentary on that video, I explained that Antonius Andreas is actually the first person to have formulated the law of identity. So the question is, if Aristotle didn't come up with the law of identity, what was his differentiating feature? Alright, well, that's a bit like asking what was Ayn Rand's differentiating feature. Now you could say her discovery that life is the source of all values, and her justification of egoism, its basis, what it means, her whole ethics. You could say that's Ayn Rand's distinguishing feature. But that would be wrong. It was genius and revolutionary, but Ayn Rand had genius and revolutionary positions in epistemology, metaphysics, politics, and aesthetics. So what's really revolutionary about Ayn Rand is that she had a whole system of revolutionary ideas. The same is true with Aristotle. You can't pick out just one thing from Aristotle and say, this is what he's revolutionary for. The way I put it in a sentence is, Aristotle is the first person to systematize philosophy on a natural and rational foundation. Plato was the first person to systematize philosophy at all, and he did it on a supernatural and mystical foundation. And then Aristotle did the opposite. The way it's often put is, Plato came up with all the questions of philosophy, and Aristotle gave all of the answers. But now let's get into this system of Aristotle's. Let's look at what he believed essentially in each area and how it was so revolutionary. And Aristotle was revolutionary. Every good thing we have today is a result of Aristotle. Ayn Rand, John Locke, Thomas Aquinas, none of these people would have been possible without Aristotle. Now, Aristotle was not influential immediately. It took hundreds of years for him to become influential, first in the Arab world, and then back in medieval Europe. And in medieval Europe, he was so influential that people actually regarded him as having known everything. He was the master of all knowledge. Now, this was back when much less was known, of course, but to those people, Aristotle knew literally everything. In fact, it was seen as a legitimate form of argument simply to say that Aristotle had said something. They had a Latin phrase for it, ipse dixit, which translates to he said it himself. That's what medieval scholars would say, ipse dixit. Aristotle said it. You're going to argue with Aristotle? This is how influential Aristotle became. It is impossible to overstate the magnitude of Aristotle's achievements. But let's look at what they actually were. What revolutionary ideas did he actually integrate? First, metaphysics. What did he come up with in metaphysics? Well, since people had begun thinking about metaphysics, there was a tension between being and becoming, between one and many. We see that there are things, but we also see that things change. This tension came out most dramatically in the clash between Parmenides and Heraclitus. Parmenides said, there is only one thing, and it is unchanging. Change, that's impossible. Multiplicity, that's impossible. How could things change if they are what they are? Then you have Heraclitus, who said there is only change. There are no things. And he essentially agreed with Parmenides, but took the other end. If things change, how can they ever be what they are? So these were some basic confusions at the beginning of philosophy, and this is where Plato came in. You see, Plato's mysticism and supernaturalism, his theory of forms, was an attempt to reconcile this. Plato said, okay, how do we reconcile identity and change, and singularity and multiplicity? How do we do that? How can we have both? And so what Plato said was, well, this physical world that we live in, this is the world of change and multiplicity. But then there's another world, a world of forms, where things are singular and unchanging. And that's how we can have both, because this world is just a reflection of the real immaterial world. So there's one dimension for each kind of phenomenon. Now, what Aristotle did was solve this problem in a rational, natural way. He didn't appeal to supernaturalism and mysticism to reconcile being and becoming, singularity and multiplicity. Plato had said that real existence was immaterial in another dimension, and everything in this world took part in the form, the singular form, in another dimension. So all trees in this world are inferior refractions of the pure tree, immaterial tree in another dimension. There's just this immaterial form of tree, and then it gets refracted into all the many different physical trees that we see. And so you have the one and the many. And so for Plato, the real world was supernatural, immaterial. It was this purely abstracted form. Now, what Aristotle did was say, no, all that exists is this world. He basically took Plato's idea of form and said, no, form is not something that exists in another dimension. It exists here. Form exists, but only in the particular things. There is no abstracted pure form in another dimension. Each tree has its own little bit of treeness. So there is no other dimension. Now, this is a step in the right direction, but it's still a mistake. This is the view that there are things called universals. In other words, bits of things that are exactly the same. But there is nothing about two trees that are exactly the same if you get detailed enough. But Aristotle thought there was, and his view was actually a more sophisticated view in which he thought it wasn't just that there were universals, but there were metaphysical essences. In other words, the universals were the core of a thing, and then you could have accidental, non-essential characteristics layered on top. So there's like a core of treeness that's the same in every tree, but then all the different things we see about trees, that's just all the different accidental characteristics on top. So that was Aristotle's view. Now that's wrong. I don't have time to go into it here because I'm just trying to explain why Aristotle was so revolutionary, but he was revolutionary because even though that's wrong, it's moving things in the right direction. It's kind of like Thomas Jefferson was against a national bank, but he was for a bunch of state banks. Now, state banks are not quite free banking. It's still not free, but it's moving in the right direction. It's closer to freedom, more local. There's a sense in which that's closer to freedom than having a big federal bank. Similar here. It's not that Aristotle fully got rid of this idea of these supernatural universals, but he did restrain them to this world. So he got rid of a supernatural dimension. So that is a huge step in the right direction. That's essentially Aristotle's contribution to metaphysics. I mean, there's a lot more he said about this and about the things I'm about to say. His views on substance and form and matter and all of that. Genius, but I'm just giving you the essentials right now. So that's metaphysics. Epistemologically, Aristotle basically discovered reason, specifically deduction. Aristotle worked out the rules for deductive inference. All A is B, all B is C, therefore all A is C. Now, before Aristotle, people had, of course, used deductive arguments, but they couldn't do it self-consciously. They couldn't be self-consciously logical. Now they actually knew the rules. People could actually look and see, did I follow this rule correctly? And you see even today, people make logically fallacious arguments all the time. So if people can do it today, thousands of years after Aristotle discovered it, it was just as bad or worse before. At least now with Aristotle, people could check, if they cared to, whether their arguments actually held up. Because Aristotle had discovered the rules for making valid arguments, at least deductive ones. He got started a little bit on induction, didn't go too far with that. essentially just said the soul is so constituted as to be capable of performing this process. In terms of concepts themselves, as I said, Aristotle believed that concepts referred to metaphysical essences, this core being of things, on top of which you could layer all of these different accidental characteristics, which is why all trees are different, even though they're all still trees. They have a core of treeness and then a bunch of different stuff layered on top. So I thought concepts, they refer to that core, that essential core. Now, this is actually where the idea of insight comes in. Insight is the idea that things have a special essence, and if you look at them long enough, you can see into them, into these singular things, and understand what you need to understand about them. You can get an insight. You can see in and see how they relate to other things or how to categorize them. Now, that's a big problem because, as Ayn Rand discovered, conceptualization is a necessarily relational process. You can't do it by just looking at one thing. The whole point is you do it in contrast to other things. So the whole idea of insight and metaphysical essence is flawed, but I won't get into that now. Ethics. Aristotle is an egoist. He recognizes that the purpose of life is eudaimonia, which means flourishing, related to happiness. And he believes there are certain virtues that you use to get there. Now, his view was that everything has a function. Human beings have a function. We are reasoning beings, so we should use reason and act in accordance with our nature, and we will then be successful and happy. And Aristotle was pro-wealth and friendship and all of the values of this world, and pro-reason and rationality. Now, he didn't quite get the connection between reason and productivity, but he did advocate both of these realms, even though he didn't connect them. He was pro-physical wealth, pro-spiritual values, pro-virtue, pro-happiness, pro-egoism. And he laid all of that out. In politics, John Locke had not yet discovered the idea of rights, because Aristotle had not yet existed to give everyone such a solid foundation. But Aristotle's view was the best you could do given what he had. He came up with a whole organization of different kinds of political systems, and he had rule by one person, rule by a few people, and rule by all the people, and he had good and bad versions of all of these. And what he ultimately decided on was democracy was probably best because its corrupt form was least damaging. So it was a kind of hedging your bets. Now, democracy is the best you can do if you don't understand rights. I mean, the Greeks were rational in this way. Obviously, a system of individual rights is the only way to go. But before you understand rights and you don't quite know how people should live together, the system that seems most consonant with freedom is, well, let's let everybody decide and not restrict this to one person. At least then everybody is kind of free politically in terms of voting. Everybody can vote, and that's least likely to be tyrannical because you don't have one person going crazy and having all the power, or a few people doing that. So Aristotle basically did the best he could with what he had. He's just one man. He can't discover everything in one lifetime. And then in aesthetics, Aristotle's view was famously that art is more important than history, because history tells you what has been. Art tells you what could be and should be. He was essentially romantic in the objectivist sense. Ayn Rand believed in romantic realism. That was her view of what art should be. It should present the world as it might be and ought to be. Not just as it actually is, but not as some impossible fantasy either. And this was Aristotle's view. Art should be a projection of the possible ideal. And he had, of course, many more things to say about aesthetics than I can go into here. But that was basically Aristotle. He believed this world exists. We can know it through reason. We should seek our own individual happiness, live in a system of freedom, and produce art that shows us what's possible. And he integrated all of these revolutionary points into a system. They all fit together. It's not like one thing over here contradicts one thing over here. I mean, he had contradictions, but the essence of everything, the essence of all of his major ideas, integrated into this rational, natural worldview. And no one had done anything close to that before. In other words, Aristotle set the foundation for all of the right answers in philosophy. He didn't get everything exactly right, but he came up with the essentially correct answers and worked them out substantially in every area of philosophy, and no one had ever done that before. Only one person had even ever come up with a system of philosophy before, and that was his teacher Plato. So it's a little like thinking about Citizen Kane. You go back and you watch Citizen Kane and you think, maybe this isn't that amazing. I don't see what's so big about it. Well, what's big about it is that all of these things you take for granted in movies, you take for granted because Citizen Kane did them first. Same with Aristotle. In order to appreciate Aristotle, you have to understand how much you take for granted came from him. It is absolutely amazing how much people take for granted, how much reasoning and rationality and methodology people take for granted. I mean, people today laugh at the Salem witch trials and the idea of trying to divine omens from falling leaves and things like that. Human beings without logic, without somebody like Aristotle, naturally fall into that. They are helpless. What Aristotle was doing was not obvious. All these things that people take for granted today, that had to be invented by Aristotle. So in that sense, if you remember in the video, Rucka is pushing on this idea that these seemingly obvious things Aristotle came up with are revolutionary. That is absolutely true. You cannot emphasize that enough. Just how primitive people are when they don't have Aristotelian rational philosophy. Why do you think people in Africa believe eating albino people or drinking their blood or whatever will cure AIDS? That's what happens when you don't have Aristotle. That is the natural state of man. Reason is not obvious. Common sense is not something that just comes naturally to people. It absolutely does not. Without somebody like Aristotle, the world is a brutal, disgusting, violent, primitive, irrational, incoherent place. And all of these things people attribute to, it's just common sense. No, it is not. That is Aristotelian sense, and you owe him everything. So that's that on Aristotle. Well, I've gone on for a while, but I feel bad just doing one question, so I'm going to do one more, which is also quite substantial. Do objectivists believe in the correspondence theory of truth, namely that truth is that which corresponds with facts in the world? Yes. Objectivism explicitly, Ayn Rand explicitly endorsed the correspondence theory of truth. Now, as with any historical philosophical position, it comes with some erroneous baggage. So let me explain what does not come along with this view. What does not come along with this view is the idea that correspondence is in any way in conflict with coherence. That is the classical alternative to correspondence theory. Correspondence says something is true because it corresponds to the external world. Coherence says something is true because it fits together with other truths or other ideas. And a dichotomy between these two is usually expressed. Coherence is possible because it doesn't necessarily reflect the world. So you can build these coherent, neat, tidy, rationalistic structures that go together, whereas the world is messy. The correspondence view is something is true because it corresponds to the world. Well, the world is this messy Heraclitean flux. Who can ever say what's true today is not going to be true tomorrow? So correspondence theory doesn't produce truths that cohere. Wrong. Because of the law of identity, because everything is what it is, there are no contradictions in reality. The fact that something corresponds to reality, the fact that something is true means it necessarily coheres with all other truths. This is why objectivist logic involves two practices, reduction and integration. Reduction is the correspondence aspect. You take your abstract idea and you see, does this refer to something in reality? But you also integrate, which is the coherence standard. You say, does this fit with everything else I know? So there is no conflict between correspondence and coherence. It's not that things cohere because they're detached, and correspondence truths don't necessarily cohere because they refer to the real world. No, exactly the opposite. Things are true because they refer to the real world, or that's what truth is. Truth is correspondence to reality, but because of that, because reality is what it is, all truths cohere. So you can check them in that way too. You can see, do they fit together? It's like checking a math problem, an analogy, but it's like checking a math problem. You do the math problem, and if you did it right, you got the right answer, but to check, you do some other kind of operation that would also produce the right answer to see if you did it right. And if that checks out, you got it. That's like how knowledge works. Truth refers to correspondence with the external world, but all truths cohere because reality coheres. Reality is one, truth is one. So yes, Objectivism endorses the correspondence theory of truth, but that does not put us in any way in conflict with the coherence view, unless you take the coherence view to mean, which some people do, something is true because it fits together with other things, no matter how it relates to reality, even if it contradicts reality. That's totally wrong. If you'd like to keep up with everything I do, just go to charlestew.com. If you'd like to enable me to do more, just go to patreon.com/charlestew and become a supporter. Thanks for listening.